Perfect.
So Sam, welcome at the webinar. So very pleased to have you here and talk today about semi-automated object detection workflows using UAV imagery.
Mm-hmm.
The webinar, it's organized by, you can see basically the logos here also. It's next to IPPN. It's IPPN. It's an international plant phenotyping network that tries to integrate plant phenotyping activities across the globe. Then we have Emphasis. Emphasis is a European research infrastructure which focuses on integrating and developing a community within Europe and integrating this community around infrastructure, phenotyping infrastructure, and develop a long-term perspective to provide also services to users, among others, also services to the field, to do field phenotyping experiments, and EPPN, the third project, which will end within the next couple of months. EPPN provided directly services. So EPPN, it's an EU-funded project that was able to, on the one hand, integrate the community, but also provide access to the services, access to the facilities that were included in EPPN. So we have a strong focus from this project on plant phenotyping, community integration, providing platforms for people to demonstrate what they do, and there is a strong interest in basically facilitating, promoting plant phenotyping. And this is one of the reasons behind this webinar series, and we are very pleased to have you here today. So very briefly, so Sam, your background, you are a data scientist working at Vito Remote Sensing right now within the MAPEO team. I think you will explain probably briefly what MAPEO also means. And you aim in general on empowering researchers with access to drone data and insight it generates. So you primarily work on implementation improvement of advanced machine learning algorithms, which is very exciting, and to allow users to leverage the power of diverse data sources and optimize machine learning architecture to detect features of the field trials, which sounds really interesting and intriguing, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Maybe starting basically also a question about you, some background on you. So you are a data scientist. You have no background in plant sciences, right?
That is correct. So I'm not a plant scientist by background. My background is actually in a related field, so environmental science. I am from Australia originally, where I did my bachelor's in environmental science and then worked in environmental consulting, but in a kind of less related field. So then it was more air quality assessment. After that, I moved over here to Belgium, where I'm currently living, and did a master's degree at KU Leuven and the University of Brussels, which was in geography with a specialization in geographic information systems and spatial modeling. And so this kind of lends itself then to using things like drones or satellite imagery and these other kind of mapping tools for different purposes. And so I, after finishing that, joined the MAPEO team at Vito, where I'm now working on plant phenotyping within the MAPEO team. And so here, whilst I don't have this kind of plant background, I think it is a background that's still useful or to plant phenotypers as a kind of as someone who can help facilitate their access to using kind of new technologies, so like drone imagery, artificial intelligence, and kind of other tools from the data science toolbox, which they themselves might not be so exposed to.
This is usually within this phenotyping community that it is a very diverse community. So we rely and depend on interaction with people coming from different disciplines. But any specific reasons that made you go towards plant sciences, or was it because I can imagine for data scientists there are many interesting questions. You have this, yeah.
Yeah, certainly. Well, I think a lot of it was to do with my background and kind of what I was always interested in my studies. So this was to do with things relating to kind of yeah, plant health, or kind of how we can kind of better grow things, produce better agricultural crops as we move into a new kind of climate change future. How can we optimize growth, optimize varieties in the future as well. And so this is something that, yeah, when I did my master's, a lot of like my thesis project was also on using UAV imagery to assess um, kind of changing soil patterns in Latin America. And I just found it also very interesting as well compared to a lot of other applications of data science. It's nice data to work with drone imagery of fields. There tends to be pretty pictures as well, so it's nice to look at too. And yeah, there's also to me like a clear benefit to bringing my skills to this domain and working within it.
It's great to see that data scientists, and I think we are hopefully also or get some more people involved in plant sciences, because this challenge which you will also probably introduce, that's detecting green plant features with a green background. It's actually pretty interesting, and it's sometimes more intriguing than I don't know, autonomous vehicles where probably.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's the other thing. For things like object detection, it's a really interesting kind of challenge because often you're trying to compared to say yeah, autonomous vehicles where you might be detecting really kind of big single objects throughout an image. Here you're trying to detect often a lot of instances of objects, which are usually quite small, and also in a quite confusing image where you might have the actual object itself, but you'll have like then different leaves, or maybe some other plant features, or even like the background kind of soil or vegetation that might confuse the image. So it's yeah, exciting to try and solve that problem too.
So we are moving then slowly towards you know, the content of your work. Should we start with basically a short summary? So we have already a number of questions, but it might be useful to briefly summarize with few key slides what you do.
Yeah, sure.
And then talk about the questions.
Yeah, sounds good to me. I can do so. Yeah. So just as a quick summary, these are just going to come from the PowerPoint I showed to everyone. So yeah, this was what I kind of talked about during my webinar, as I'm sure many of you are aware. So I quickly introduced PhenomicsWebinars. We're a research institute in Belgium. I talked then about why object detection is useful for plant phenotyping. So this is because we're getting lots of higher resolution imagery, as well as lots of advances in machine learning kind of theory and the ability to kind of practically apply machine learning at scale, which is making it easier to do it. So in the past, for example, for things like plant organ detection, it was very difficult to actually do this kind of object detection for multiple reasons. This was partly because it was harder to get these very high resolution images using a drone, because the drone and drone cameras weren't good enough to do so, and might end up ruining or it wouldn't be possible to actually collect good images and stitch them for an entire field, which would be what you'd want for a trial. And in addition, the machine learning architectures have come a long way in the last few years. So the actual detection of all these small objects has historically been kind of a problem for a lot of object detection architectures, and only now is becoming easier to solve with improved architectures and improved workflows for it. And so I talk a bit about some of the challenges which I just kind of addressed, which affected the applicability of object detection in the past. So camera quality also has a big impact. So you want to have nice looking images and at a high resolution, which with advances in kind of drone cameras and their affordability and their usability, their practicality, it's becoming easy to actually get the needed resolution. So for example, the advent of 100 megapixel cameras like the phase 1 is making it a lot easier to take these pictures. And so what we're doing in MAPEO is creating an end-to-end drone processing workflow, which the object detection workflow is becoming an increasingly important part. So we're working with numerous clients and partners on different data sets and trying to leverage the large amount of data to build very robust models for various different object detection tasks. And then also making it easier for end users to access and utilize that data. So by providing these kind of inference data sets where it's possible to kind of already have in your field these object inferred data sets where you can delineate plots and produce plot statistics. So in comparison to traditional methods of either plant counting or of organ counting, so such as wheathead detection, it's instead of having a kind of labor-intensive field counting or post-harvest counting process, it's possible to get for each plot accurate count and an accurate kind of density per square meter output relatively easily. And so I've also talked a bit about the results and kind of what we've worked on. We also try lots of different new features which we think are particularly applicable to the phenotyping use case. So by augmenting the pictures to account for different lighting conditions that you might experience due to changing sunlight, as well as rotating the images, because in most cases it doesn't matter which angle you look at or which direction you're looking from above at, to improve the results. In addition, including things like pseudo labeling to make up for what is often very difficult to label data sets. So when you have a human labeler, you will usually end up in cases like wheathead detection or other dense images, especially images that aren't fully labeled. And so we are trying to rectify that and then subsequently improve the results. So yeah, I also have some comparisons of the different models that we have used so far. And then I talk a bit more about like the future use cases. So in this kind of early stage, a lot of people have been interested in just getting these kind of counts and density analysis, but going forward, it's going to be the case that people will want more analysis. And as a research institute, we're interested in kind of working on finding what other things we can actually get out of this object detection data. And so one way to achieve this is looking into segmentation, which in addition to actually improving the model performance by having objects which are only representing the object and no background, also allow for us to look into things like the actual volume of objects, the width, the height in some cases. And this is something we're looking at in the future. And there can be, for object detection, other useful features, such as if you are performing multiple flights over a trial field, getting your GCPs tagged is an important step. In the case of the MAPEO workflow, it's currently the only manual step, but we're working to automate this as well, which is of course possible with an object detection and AI selection algorithm. And this can also apply to other features in the field. So if you have, say, a disease to detect, or multiple different objects, then these kind of features can kind of be extended on top of it. And so that was kind of an overview of it. I work for Veto. Particularly, I work with UAV object detection and making workflows which are accessible to researchers and other users in order to kind of help their own phenotyping applications. So yeah, that was the overview.
Yeah, thanks for that. It was really very helpful to kind of summarize your talk. So it was a pleasure to look at the entire talk in more detail. So there were over 100 people who watched your talk. So it's not only interesting for me, but for many others as well. And there are many interesting things you mentioned. So I would start with some few questions, but let me first, so you just also to understand your Veto MAPEO. So you are involved also in you are providing also services. So you work also for users, mostly for researchers, or also other companies. So,
Both. So we work both in partnerships with researchers and also with commercial seed breeding or other companies. And so there's a mix for us. And I think, for the most part, like in both cases, they're interesting researching kind of projects to look at. And it's, for us, it's always very interesting as well if there is a new research project which is or a potential partnership which allows us to look at kind of a new kind of experimental application or some kind of new research, which is what Veto as an institute is kind of aiming at, like providing a bridge between academia and industry, let's say. So working a lot on applied research and how we can utilize that kind of.
That sounds very exciting because you can potentially address many different topics, many different crops, many different questions that you can specifically address, and that answers already the first question. So there was someone asking, are there any specific project areas in phenotyping? Veto is currently seeking for collaboration. I think we don't need to go any specific projects, but right now people know how that they can address you. And you can point them into the right direction. So the first question is answered, and that was also my impression from Veto, from MAPEO, that you are very open for collaboration and can also tackle the challenging questions in a very useful, helpful way.
Yeah, for sure, definitely.
Yeah, but let me looking at this case studies that you showed, it makes an impression to me that many of those approaches, they depend on this annotation and your reference data sets. You mentioned that most of these annotations are then done manually, or they need to be okay. So what's the how does it work? So what's the time requirements, and are you annotating those images?
No. So there's multiple approaches that you can take to annotating images. I don't do much annotation myself. Normally, if it's something that is, let's say, a new object detection task. So if they're, for example, if we work on, say, a new segmentation task, which isn't similar to any of the things we've done before, then I will do some especially initial annotation just to kind of provide both a proof of concept, but then also to create a sort of instruction manual for annotation teams. So for annotation, because with these object detection models, you generally want to have very high high amounts of labeled data. Essentially, like there's a point where you'll generally probably have enough, but there's no kind of limit to like the improvements. Maybe just a point where it starts leveling off. But even to get like a model that doesn't overfit too much, you do want to have yeah, quite a bit of labeled data, and definitely more than what I would be able to kind of label myself. And so for the annotation, as I mentioned, we work with an AI provider, RoboVision, who is also in Belgium, and they provide an annotation platform. And this is kind of shared throughout the remote sensing research unit at VITO. And there's different ways that you can kind of approach the annotation. So we often work with some local students that we use for annotation. And there are also annotation companies that we work with as well. In addition, other partners might want to have more control over the labeling, or even to do some labeling themselves. And then we can open up this tool to them to do labeling. So yeah, it's not done personally. I do like to kind of take an overseeing role where I can provide like instructions and then check that the quality of the labels is good, since another thing with object detection, of course, is that you generally want to have very high quality labeling. But yeah, there's different approaches that you can take to who does the labeling, depending on kind of how much data you have, how much manpower you want to put in, and what manpower budget is available to you.
You mentioned that there are also tools for annotation, but which probably help. But in the end, you still need this human eye, don't you?
Yeah. So for most cases, you need the human eye. In object detection, it is still the case that we're using manually labeled data because the computer can't learn what a pumpkin is if you don't show it pumpkins, basically. So yeah, and that's something that is I think it is a concern to people as well. And it's something, yeah, I did talk about in the webinar, whereby there have been a lot of cases where people have done this object detection, but they haven't been able to scale it so effectively because often the models aren't very general. So if you do object detection, even if it's the same crop on one field, it won't necessarily get good results on another field. Like it can, but it's not guaranteed. And so at the start, you do probably need to label kind of a lot of variety of data. So a few different fields in different locations or different varieties, depending on the crop. But what we kind of envision is that this can become less over time as you leverage larger amounts of data. And what we try to provide with MAPEO is a kind of way that, so we try to encourage standardized collection of data, so that when you are performing object detection on different sites, the error is going to come because the model just doesn't know how to classify something in that scenario. Whereas for kind of a lot of ad hoc jobs, there can be one job which is collected with the camera being flown at, let's say, 4mm resolution, and another at 2.5 millimeters resolution. And maybe the first flight was flown at 4 p.m. in the day and the other flight was flown at midday or something. So you might end up with different lighting conditions. So we try to, as much as we can, encourage kind of standard lighting conditions and through our workflow, kind of standardized processing of the images. So you have ortho mosaics that are kind of comparable at the end. And then for the object detection workflow, also pre-processing the data so that it can be used between the data can be combined into a single model, which can then be generalized. So yeah, having it using the same kind of image size inputs as different tiles, using the same contrast and brightness adjustment or whatever other augmentation you add to it. So yeah, that's
there was actually a question related to that. So this the environmental conditions, which you already addressed, that when the transferability from one field to another, when the environment changes, I suppose when I don't know, the soil, the background is wet or dry, it may be different than the sun angle. Can you address that by the amount of training data sets? When this training data sets are large enough, then you don't need to, then it will be solved, or do you still expect that there will be issues with?
I think it would be, it would be fine once the data set is large enough. And the main reason that error can occur is that there's just something that a model hasn't seen before. But they're usually, and the kind of architectures we use are quite dynamic and quite versatile to having lots of different kind of conditions in the one data set. So if you have, for example, a huge data set which has some images with wet ground and some with dry ground, then it is still going to perform well with these images, because part of the weights will probably, of the weights that the model kind of trains itself to have, will address like, what does it mean if there's wet ground in the image? What does it mean if there's dry ground? What does it mean if there's a shadow coming from one direction? So yeah, this is addressed like through the kind of architecture itself. And yeah, as you kind of get more data, then it becomes more confident in its predictions. So if you only have like, if you have 10 sites and only one has wet ground, and then you try and do inference on another site with wet ground, then it might be that it performs well, but it won't perform with as much confidence if it's similar to the other wet ground site. But yeah, essentially, the more data, the more it can generalize, and it can also account for, if you do have it more generalized, then it can actually also work somewhat better with data that's maybe a little bit different from what you've seen before.
Okay, that sounds pretty good. And when you do the next step, when you want to move from one, we can stay within one species, from one wheat variety to another wheat variety. Is it still, because they still may have some different features? Does it still work, or do you need to start from scratch, developing a new data set when you move from? You could also go further. You know, you go from bread wheat towards durum wheat towards barley. How far can you, when you have one training data set with all those environmental conditions, background that you need for one species or for one variety, how easy is the transferability towards another one?
Yeah, well, here it depends a bit on what you're trying to transfer for, and also what the exact thing it is you're trying to detect. So like looking at different wheat varieties, we did in one of our kind of trials train on a field, or on two fields rather, that one had I couldn't tell you the varieties, but one had one type of variety very heavily that we trained on, and the other had a big variety of varieties, and definitely the detection was better on the one where you already saw the variety. But this is also kind of a problem where it's like the conditions, if it's only the one object class, So it's only wheat you're looking at and not durum wheat versus red wheat or any other kind of varieties. It is, the model will be able to learn kind of both, and both of them could be given this object class. So one way to actually kind of think of the object detection models, especially the architectures we use, is that it isn't an architecture that it only basically looks at, is this wheat or not, or is this a variety of wheat, whatever. So what it actually first trains for is to look for, is the part of the image it's looking at. So it identifies potential, like just interesting parts of the image, essentially, like which have like changing textures or changing colors or like lots of contrasting edges. And then it first detects like, is this an object of any class? And then afterwards it assigns what class of object it is, if it is an object indeed. So you could, for we just have like everything kind of as one single object class, and you could even do this for like multiple different kind of agricultural objects. So you could say, is this a plant organ, or is this a plant emergence of any kind? And then it would train to like detect it. Then transferring onto different varieties, it's a pretty easy process. So if you did want to like move from wheat to barley, or you wanted to even move to specific types of wheat, so you wanted to split your wheat classifier, then it would still be useful to use these kind of weights of the model from before as the basis, because it would start with these. It would start with like this initial classifier of, is this an object, and is this an object of class durum wheat, and then from there it would just update the model, update the weights based on like, okay, so we try and classify everything using the old weights and see what's wrong, and then just like slowly move from there. So it is, and that's also part of what we kind of work with. So we try and make models periodically once we have like a lot of new data, which contain all of our agricultural data. And then from there kind of build additional models which target wheat head count, or pumpkin counting, potato emergence, maize emergence, whatever have you. So yeah.
Yeah, that's it's good that you don't need to start from scratch when you move from one variety to another one, because that would be, you know, restarting the work again and again. I think the very useful, helpful thing for Vito is, so you have your own data acquisition pipelines, you have your own pipelines. What would be your idea when you would like to? So this is the challenge that we are trying to do in emphasis, that you want to do standardization on the European level or potentially global level. So wheat is measured all over the world. There are many different people. So you also mentioned there are technical issues that you need to take into account. How would you do this? That people recording wheat, doing this kind of approaches, wanting to count wheat heads basically across the globe. That you enable common standards that people can use them. So basically not avoid this redeveloping of tools ever and ever again, which happens quite often right now. How do you, any suggestions how to address this?
I guess, just try and, for this kind of standardization, I mean, it starts with I'd say data collection. So you want to actually just standardize how you collect the images, essentially. So train your pilots to like operate in the same way, to use the same kind of ground controls, to try and basically always try and fly at midday or under under sunny conditions or under cloudy conditions even is probably better, depending on where you are. So I think that's it. I think if you want to like work kind of globally, then for weed head detection, yeah, like because it's going to be very hard to actually control the wheat fields and make them extremely similar looking in different environments, because there's different soils everywhere, there's different kind of potential invasive species, whatever. So, but you can a lot more easily like standardize the way you collect images. So you can have the drones fly at a certain height. Generally, the actual kind of cameras that you use are available globally. So you can also use these all over the world and have very similar image quality. And that's broadly kind of what MAPEO tries to address. So like we work with researchers who do have sites in different areas, and we want to facilitate these areas being kind of comparable both across these large spatial scales and over time, as there's changing across different seasons or during seasons as well.
Yeah, I see a potential important way to interact with emphasis because we are trying to do this kind of it's difficult to you can make recommendations, but it's usually difficult to ask everyone to use similar cameras. But I think access to reference data sets might be pretty useful, and I think you have the expertise in collecting reference data sets, and it would be useful to continue and see what others are doing, and basically extend the network and see how data can be used. But this is a general issue that we need to address, and this is under development, and there are actually a number of projects that are working on that. But coming back to some of the questions, there was related also to your entire pipeline. So what happens in this automation process in the workflow when you have outliers? Do they create any problems?
Yeah, it can. So what you normally have for outliers would probably be from the annotation kind of part of the workflow. So if you have, for example, images that are labeled very poorly, so where they miss a lot of objects because they weren't properly trained, or they label too many things, which isn't something we've had so much of an issue with. Generally, for the data sets, the outliers have come in the forms of like absence of proper labels rather than having too many labels. And so for dealing with this, these kind of outliers, one way is, of course, to just start getting more data, as always. And because then you'll hopefully most of the data will be of very good quality, and then you can kind of account for it. Another way, and this is partly why things like the pseudo labeling was something that that we started doing. This can, by first training weak models, start to append confident predictions and hopefully build up the data sets until it eventually covers the actual target object class and the image correctly, and then you have a higher quality data set. And then other kind of forms of outliers might be if you have kind of images that and showing the object class, but in kind of conditions that are very different to what you'll be classifying the rest of your data set at. So this could be, for example, if you have a lot of images in the training data set which were taken a lot closer to the ground than your other images, and then if you label these images, the model will start to think, okay, so if a weak head object is this big in terms of pixels, then it's going to be a wheathead object. Whereas in your inference data set, it might be that they're a lot smaller. And so part of the way for these kind of issues is resizing the images and just trying to provide other data augmentation. And so if it's generally in kind of neural network models, it should be generally best case avoiding outliers. They're not incredibly versatile to it compared to a lot of other models, but especially in kind of the object detection field, there is more kind of ability to handle them through data augmentation or applying new techniques to kind of augment, to change the data set or make it, add synthetic elements to it. So that's one way. Within our workflow, we also look at if we're classifying from drone images, not an orthomosaic, using just the center of drone images so that you don't have kind of oblique angles, because those are, especially if you have enough overlap, you probably only want to classify the center of an image and then stitch it together. So yeah, that's kind of some of the ways that we try and handle if we do have outliers in the data.
But it's mostly outliers on a when you do your training data sets, right? Or because the other point would be you may also have outliers when you do your experiments. There are bugs sitting on their heads. There is a deer in a which is probably easy to analyze. But this is something that you can easily detect, or the algorithm.
Well, then it will then it actually will depend a little bit on the kind of outlier in the inference. So if it is a deer, then hopefully the model just says, okay, so that's nothing.
Exactly.
But for bugs, for other things, it could be more of an issue. So if you have something else covering the data, then this is something that should probably be ideally addressed during the collection of the flights, but obviously that can't always be the case. And it might be that if it doesn't perform well, it is always possible to label more. So it might be that if you do have bugs, the model might initially think this can't possibly be an organ because it doesn't have so many bugs on it. But then you could retrain on this data so that you would still accept it as an organ if you included these bugs. That would be the most kind of simple way to handle it.
Related to this reference data sets or your training data sets, there is a question about it's actually an interesting question. Could you imagine that by means of gamification, so making games if directly related to annotation of phenotyping data sets, of annotation tasks, citizen scientists, citizen science approaches, would that be something that you could would you consider that interesting, or did you try any citizen science approaches for data annotation?
No, not yet. Within Veto, we do work with other kind of citizen science kind of initiatives, but not in this project at this point. But it is a really interesting idea. And I think there's a lot of things to think about with kind of, gamification of the annotation. Because you still do want to produce high quality annotations in the end. And I'm not sure what the approach would be to kind of ensure that people, when using this kind of process, would be able to ensure that the annotations are high quality. Although I'm sure that there's some ideas for it.
Sure. So I know a nice experiment from a colleague from Edinburgh. So they did a pretty large citizen science experiment. It was not really on a crop; it was on Arabidopsis. So the rosette plant of plant scientists. So it was very simple on counting leaves, and they they had, I don't know, a huge data set, and they asked,
Yeah.
so they did the citizen science approach where they asked a number of people. So they started their workshops, spread the images to basically citizens, then they used students, then they used their own annotators. So it was an interesting approach where they could compare citizen science, students, the professional annotators, and different algorithms. And the interesting output was that so many of the citizen science people involved, it was kind of a retired senior people, highly genuinely interested in science, and they did it in a very careful way. And it was it was a very the best data sets came from this citizen science from those groups, which is might be interesting to think about it and come up with follow-up activities on that.
Yeah, absolutely. That does sound interesting, actually.
It was kind of a very time-consuming work because you need to. I don't know how many people are involved in that, but it was few hundred of retired senior citizen science citizens from Scotland. But it's pretty cool approach.
Yeah, absolutely. It sounds nice.
Yeah, but talking about novel approaches. There is also a question in terms of measurable plant traits, object detection. Is there? Sorry, wrong questions. What are the current frontiers? So that was the question. Sorry about it. What are the current frontiers in UAV parameters, trait detection, apart from derived height, multispectral indices? So it's more this. What would be the next steps? What do you think this the developments in remote sensing of plant traits? Where do we go with this? What would be the future challenges, future developments?
I think that what we're working a lot on, and what is kind of the future, which is now kind of allowed by all these kind of technological advances, is more. So in the past, I'd say obviously things like plant height are very useful, or plant cover as well. But moving away from kind of indices and moving more towards kind of direct detection of say different traits. So obviously object detection is one such thing where you look at say plant emergence or organ counting or other features. Other ones could be for disease mapping, which could also be done in a similar kind of using a similar machine learning approach where you have labeled data sets of plants with diseases and plants without diseases. This is something that I think is going to become especially interesting in the future if with multispectral data, where you can kind of, you have additional bands which can kind of better show the internal health of the plant, and being able to label if it's known. So one of the probably problems here is actually kind of labeling the data set to show where you have a diseased plant and where you don't have a diseased plant. But I think that's for sure one of the frontiers. And then the other thing is moving really into getting kind of like the size of plants and of objects. So for the first step for organ counting is of course like actually detecting the density where you have the objects. But then, and it can depend on the crop, there are other interesting things to look at. So for example, for some vegetables like pumpkins or lettuce or something, there's the object detection, but then you want to derive the actual size of it, which can be done kind of using a just a simple kind of like height times width. If you have the base height in a plant height map, and then the width derived from say a segmentation model. But going forward, it might be possible to get even more high quality kind of reports or indices for this. So for example, by using point cloud data, which is the initial data that orthomosaics are made from, where all the points are matched and you have a kind of 3D image of the entire field. And then, yeah, moving more into kind of more derivatives of object detection. So instead of just detecting like what plant you're looking at, so you might also detect for emergence how many leaves there are, the leaf angle, and these kind of things, which will come, and these will come as there's further advance in the camera technologies, further advance in machine learning theory, and kind of more accessibility to computational power to do them. I think you're muted, Roland.
Yeah, it was just 1 year of home office, so
Oh, right.
still not enough to learn that.
Yeah. Happens to me too.
Yeah, but it's interesting. Then there are many different approaches, challenges for this. There are many different new things. One thing that would particularly I would be interested in is so what we are thinking quite often about is intercropping systems.
Mm-hmm.
So intercropping systems, they're very classical system. It's you have maize or corn, squash, and bean. So you grow those 3 crops in one field, and you have that. In the end, the advantage is that you produce in terms of crops yield or calories per hectare. You produce much more because you have 3 crops. But and you also use the space more efficiently because before, when maize is still small, then you have already beans covering the surface area. So you reduce the water flow, reduce the leaking of nitrogen. So and bean, it's a legume, so the bean is there also putting nitrogen into the soil. So there are many advantages of those systems. The difficulty is, on the one hand, you have 3 different crops on one spot, 3 different times for harvesting, and in the end, you need to do. You can't do your harvesting by any machines. So you need to detect. So what are my beans? When can I harvest those?
Yeah.
Have also. So it would be going a step ahead when you have. You need this artificial intelligence for detection, but also acting. So detecting actor sensor approaches. So you can sense there are specific fruits that I would like to harvest. You need to detect them, find them, cut them, harvest them.
Yeah, indeed.
Because those systems are very productive, but so far they are way too expensive because all the harvest is done manually. Do you think those kind of approaches where you have multi-crop systems that could be addressed also, or how challenging is it to address those systems with machine learning approaches?
Yeah, it's well, it depends, I think, a bit on the crop as well, and how difficult it is to like do kind of harvest date prediction, especially. So this is something, and there's different approaches. So it could depend what the actual like inputs are going to be that are going to give you a good model for this prediction. So if you, maybe it is the case that the planting date or the initial emergence date, say a date of kind of peak growth, can then correlate well with when you should go for harvest. It may be that looking at other things as well, like also incorporating rainfall data, satellite data, multispectral data might give you a better kind of indicator. But yeah, that's it's definitely it's a challenging, especially in a multi-crop system, to be able to kind of figure out how to do this kind of prediction. And yeah, I think there it's going to be something that is a bit more, it's going to change and going to be something that we need to look at the actual like the crop and the requirements and the setup especially. But yeah, depending on crop for sure, I think it's possible. And yeah.
But it's an interesting challenge to address.
Indeed.
So we have a few people also sitting in the audience. So I would also like to give them if there are any questions from the audience. So please also put the questions into the chat or ask directly. And I would use it also to advertise a little. So there will be, I put it onto the chat. There will be a affordable phenotyping approach. It might workshop might be also interested for you, Sam. So basically, there are ideas to use low cost instead of high-end cameras. It's a really interesting challenge. You use quite often low cost approaches because they are in many cases they are usable under, I don't know, in conditions where you don't have this high-end technology to use for. And it's quite often interesting to compare expensive approaches or to use this expensive approaches to validate and use this low-cost things to in the end also make some useful predictions. The other thing that for the phenotyping community, let me put it into the chat. There is a SCB conference, which would include plant phenotyping sessions, 2 days of plant phenotyping sessions. So you are welcome to join. And we continue also with a phenotyping webinars. So I put it into the chat as well. Sorry for this overload of advertising. Because looking at the time, we are almost approaching the end, and this is something I would like to share with you, that there are following up activities, other meetings that might be relevant for many of you, and also give the audience some time to ask any specific questions. If there are specific questions popping up, just put them please into the chat. There is anything you would like to specifically promote, something that you from either from Vito or from your perspective, your projects that are ongoing, workshops that you are involved in and think they are interesting, that you would like to share with people, with the community. That's
no, for me, not so much. Certainly, all I can do is reiterate from earlier. So at the moment, we are working a lot on this object detection things. We're working on a lot of different kind of experimental cases using either very high resolution cameras or looking at a lot of different types of crops. And of course, we're open to any partnerships if there's something that you think might be interesting, a machine learning use case. Feel free to contact me, and I'd be happy to have a chat.
What I may also invite you specifically to, there is, you may know this CVPPP, so computer vision, plant phenotyping problems. So those are our colleagues involved. They are involved in a IPPN working group, imaging group, but they are also involved in actually both projects in IPPN emphasis, EPPN 2020, and they have also data sets where they specifically create these projects. I can forward you the link.
Yeah, so that sounds fantastic.
So they have data sets and create small competitions to test algorithms, tests new. So they have this annotated data sets. They give you the data sets, and there is a very specific question. Please use the data sets to count the leaves. And then the winner gets a free ticket for the next conference, or I don't know.
Oh, cool, nice. Yeah. Perfect.
So you have the experience, and your colleagues have the experience how to do that. So feel free to invite them to this meeting.
Yeah, that sounds that sounds awesome, actually.
I can't find the link right now, but happy to forward it to you.
Yeah, please do.
And okay, it's there is something in the chat from Philip. So it's an IPPN newsletter. So there will be recently an IPPN newsletter will be sent out, and it was also promoted in the last newsletter. So happy to forward it to all of you.
Perfect, awesome.
And as such, looking at the time, so you talked already for quite some time, and I really enjoyed that. And it's really great to see that there are data scientists interested in plant sciences, and hope that we can continue develop address future new challenge. There are future new questions which are really challenging. Sure. And would be happy to continue the discussion. So see it as an initial point to just see what we do, and I hope that you and Vito will be also actively involved. You are actually actively involved in emphasis and IPPN, and happy to continue the collaboration together. And as such, any last words you would like to also share?
Well, I'd like to thank you, Roland, and IPPN for hosting us today. It was a nice webinar, and for having our having the webinar online for the last few weeks as well.
It was a pleasure.
Very much, Sam. Of course, your webinar as well as this Q&A will be dropped in our IPPN YouTube account. So in case anyone missed it or would like to reiterate viewing it, feel free to visit us there. Everything will be and remain there for you to see. Thank you very much, Sam.
Awesome.
Great.
Perfect.
Great having you.
Thanks a lot.
Absolutely. Good to be here. All right.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, guys.
Okay, and also to the rest of you, bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.